Only 9 people were in that room. 9 people who would spend the rest of their lives being asked what really happened that afternoon. And 9 people who, almost to a man, would pause before answering. Not because they couldn't remember, but because they were afraid no one would believe them. The footage was never released. There was no official record, no newspaper headline, no televised replay. Just 9 witnesses, 1 man standing, and a story that spread through the martial arts world like smoke through a closed room. Slow, suffocating, impossible to ignore. This is that story. Rewind. Hong Kong, 1972. The city is electric in a way that only cities on the edge of something feel electric. Bruce Lee is no longer a name. He is a phenomenon. Fist of Fury has already detonated across Asia like a cultural bomb. The big boss before it turned ordinary cinema halls into war zones of emotion. Men wept, men cheered, men walked out of theaters and punched walls just to feel something close to what they'd witnessed on screen. But here's the thing about fame that people forget. Fame is a magnet, and not everything it attracts is admiration. Some of what it pulls in is rage.
His name was Viktor Sorokin. You won't find him in any official martial arts record because men like Viktor spent their lives making sure records didn't exist. He was Soviet, built like a siege weapon, 6'3", 240 pounds of muscle that had been stress-tested through a decade of competitive sambo, the brutal Russian grappling system that produced fighters who treated pain like currency. Viktor wasn't just big, he was good. That distinction matters. He had arrived in Hong Kong 3 months earlier, part of a cultural delegation that was really nothing of the sort, a loose gathering of athletes, fighters, and men whose actual occupations nobody asked about too carefully. He had spent those 3 months making quiet inquiries, training in private gyms, watching, asking questions that all orbited a single center of gravity: Bruce Lee. Viktor had seen the films, not with admiration, with something colder, with the analytical eye of a man who has spent years learning how bodies break. He watched Bruce Lee move on screen and he cataloged, he measured, he calculated angles and reach and what he believed to be exploitable gaps. And he arrived at a conclusion that would define the next 6 months of his life and humiliate him in front of 9 witnesses in a room that smelled of cedar and old sweat. His conclusion was this: Bruce Lee was a performer. A spectacular one, yes, gifted beyond argument, but a performer. The speed was real, the technique was precise, but Viktor had taken down men with real technique before. He had broken real speed before, because speed without mass, he believed, was just light, and light doesn't stop a freight train. He was wrong. He just didn't know it yet. The meeting was arranged through a mutual contact whose name nobody involved has ever confirmed. What is known is that it happened in a private training space on the upper floor of a building in Kowloon, a space used by a small, serious circle of fighters who trained outside the competition system. No trophies on the walls, no photographs, just matted floors, hanging bags worn smooth with use, and the kind of silence that serious training produces. Bruce Lee arrived without announcement. That was the first thing Viktor noticed. No entourage, no assistant, no sense of occasion. He walked through the door the way a man walks into a room he's already assessed from the outside, unhurried, present, eyes moving with a quietness that Viktor would later describe, in the only interview he ever gave on the subject, as like water that is also watching you. He was smaller than Viktor expected. This was something everyone said, meeting Bruce Lee in person for the first time, and it never stopped being true. On screen, the camera did something to him, compressed and concentrated his energy until he filled the frame the way thunder fills a room. In person, he was lean, almost slight, 135 pounds. Viktor looked at him and felt something he would later refuse to call relief, but which functioned exactly like it. The 9 witnesses positioned themselves without instruction. They simply understood that something was about to happen, and they arranged themselves accordingly. 2 near the far wall, 3 sitting on a low bench, the others standing in the peripheral spaces of the room. Nobody spoke. The kind of silence that exists before significant things has its own texture, and everyone in that room could feel it.
Viktor stepped. His weight shifted forward. His hands began to move into the position they'd been trained to move into thousands of times, reaching, seeking the grip that would begin the end. And Bruce Lee simply wasn't there. Not laterally, not backward. Gone. Then, Impact. Not where Victor expected. Not where his muscle memory was already processing. From an angle that shouldn't have been geometrically available in the space between them. A position that required movement so rapid it didn't announce itself, didn't exist in the ordinary timeline of action and reaction. The strike landed on Victor's ribs. A single punch, the knuckles of 2 fingers, the Phoenix Eye Fist, a technique from Lee's Jeet Kune Do practice, focused to a point of contact smaller than a silver dollar, with the full rotational force of Bruce Lee's hips and shoulders compressed behind it. Victor Sorokin, 240 pounds of decade-trained Sambo fighter, moved sideways. Not stumbled, not shifted, moved, like something had detonated inside him. He didn't fall. Understand that, because it matters. He did not fall. Victor Sorokin was not a man who fell, but he moved in a way his body hadn't moved involuntarily in 10 years of fighting. He moved in a way that belonged to the body's emergency systems, not to its trained responses. He moved the way structures move in earthquakes, not choosing to, but having no alternative. He made a sound. The witnesses describe it differently. One called it a gasp. One called it something between a cough and a grunt. One, the Wing Chun practitioner from Guangdong, said simply that it was the sound a man makes when something real happens to him. The room was completely silent for what everyone agrees was a long time, long enough to feel geological. Bruce Lee stood exactly where the strike had landed him. He had not moved his feet. He had not reset into a defensive position. He had not looked away from Victor. Just stillness again, the same stillness as before. Victor steadied himself, put one hand briefly on his ribs, looked at Bruce Lee with an expression that the witnesses struggled to characterize, because it was not what any of them expected. It was not anger. It was not wounded pride. It was something closer to understanding, the sudden, expensive kind. He straightened up. He nodded once. Bruce Lee nodded back. That was all. No second exchange happened, not because Victor refused. From all accounts, the possibility wasn't raised. The gesture of those 2 nods contained the entire conversation that neither of them was going to have out loud. It was the acknowledgement of something having been proven, and the mutual decision not to extend the proof further. The 9 witnesses filed out of the room over the following minutes. No one spoke to each other inside the space. It wasn't until they were on the stairs, on the street, back in the unremarkable afternoon of Kowloon, with its noise and its traffic and its ordinary human texture, that any of them said anything at all.
And even then, for most of them, what they said was nothing more than a long exhale and a slow shake of the head. What do you say about something like that? What language exists for watching a man built like a weapon discover that he has brought a cannon to a lightning strike? The story circulated. Of course it did. 9 people is not a secret. It's a small and combustible community. Within weeks, the account had traveled through Hong Kong's martial arts circles with the particular velocity that true things achieve when they are also astonishing. But here's what made it different from ordinary legend building. Nobody embellished it. This is the detail that martial arts historians who have traced this story find most remarkable. In a world where stories grow in the telling, where single punches become flying kicks, where bruised ribs become broken bones, where moments become miracles, the account of what happened in that Kowloon training room stayed remarkably consistent, because the truth, as it happened, was already plenty. Victor Sorokin returned to the Soviet Union 8 weeks later. The cultural delegation concluded. He never spoke publicly about Bruce Lee during his lifetime. The single account he gave, fragmentary, to a martial arts researcher he trusted, came years later and contained this. I understood something in that room that I had been wrong about for a long time. I thought I understood what a human body could do. I was only correct about ordinary human bodies. What I saw was not ordinary. He paused in the recording. The speed, yes, everyone talks about the speed, but it was not the speed that I think about when I remember. It was the silence before it. That is what I had never encountered. That silence was the technique. Everything else was just the result. 9 people, 1 room, 1 strike, and a truth about Bruce Lee that no film, no interview, no biography has ever quite managed to capture.
because it cannot be captured in retrospect. It could only be witnessed in the moment, in real time, by real bodies sharing real space with a man who had spent his life erasing the distance between thought and action, between intention and reality, between what people believed was possible and what he simply did. The footage was never released, because there was no footage. This happened the way the most important things happen, without documentation, without ceremony, without anything to verify it except the memories of people who were there. And those 9 memories, across decades, across continents, across the noise of a world that would transform Bruce Lee into icon and symbol and brand, those 9 memories stayed the same.
The story moved the way all true things move, through close communities. Not loudly, not with the velocity of gossip, which is fast and sloppy and arrives already distorted. It moved the way a tide moves, steadily, without announcement, covering ground that didn't appear to be changing, until suddenly everything was underwater. Within 2 weeks, every serious martial artist in Hong Kong had heard a version of it. Within a month, the version had traveled to Tokyo, to Bangkok, to San Francisco's Chinatown, where men who had trained under Lee's early teachers nodded slowly when they heard it and said nothing, which meant everything. Within 3 months, it had reached people who didn't believe it, and that, as it always does, made it spread faster. The disbelievers had a point, technically speaking. A single punch? 1 strike and a 240-pound Sambo fighter moved like he'd been struck by something structural? Against a man who weighed 135 pounds? The numbers refused the story. Physics on paper refused it. But physics on paper had never shared a room with Bruce Lee. Here is what the disbelievers were missing, what everyone who encountered the story from a distance was missing, and what the 9 witnesses understood with the particular clarity of people who had been present for the education. They were calculating force incorrectly. They were thinking about weight, about mass, about the crude arithmetic of large objects striking smaller ones, and by that arithmetic, yes, the story was impossible. But Bruce Lee had spent 15 years making that arithmetic irrelevant. He had begun in Wing Chun under Ip Man in Hong Kong as a teenager, and Ip Man had given him 2 things that most teachers never give their students because most teachers don't fully possess them to give. The first was technique so refined it no longer looked like technique, it looked like thought made physical. The gap between intention and action closed to something approaching 0, the body not executing a command from the mind, but simply being the mind's movement, without delay, without translation, without the friction that separates most human intention from most human action. The second was permission. Permission to go further, to question, to take what Wing Chun gave him and ask what else existed beyond its walls. Ip Man was not a man who built cages around his students. He was a man who built foundations strong enough that his students could construct anything on top of them. Bruce Lee constructed something that had never existed before.
He called it Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. But calling it a system was already a misunderstanding. He said so himself, repeatedly, with increasing frustration at the martial arts community's need to categorize and freeze and build walls around things. Jeet Kune Do was not a style, it was the refusal of style. It was the committed practice of remaining formless, of having no fixed shape that an opponent could read, predict, or prepare for. Water, he said. Be water. It sounds like poetry. It sounds like the kind of thing you stitch onto a pillow and place in a meditation room. But in that Kowloon training hall, against a decade-trained Sambo specialist who had spent 3 months calculating exactly how to approach Bruce Lee, it was the most devastatingly practical strategy imaginable. Victor had prepared for a style. He had watched the films, studied the angles, mapped the tendencies. He had built a response architecture around what he expected to face. And what he faced had no architecture to respond to. Because you cannot grip water. You cannot prepare for what refuses to have a shape. 3 weeks after the Kowloon meeting, something happened that has never been formally connected to it, but which the witnesses, those 9 people who carried the afternoon in their bodies for the rest of their lives, always understood as directly downstream of what they saw. A challenge arrived. Not to Bruce Lee, not directly. It arrived instead through the network of teachers and training halls and quiet arrangements that governed how serious fighters in Hong Kong found each other when they needed to. A message, passed through intermediaries, from a man whose name nobody has published and whose identity remains genuinely uncertain, though the accounts consistently describe him as a Thai fighter, experienced, with a record that commanded respect in regional competition. The message was not aggressive, it was not a taunt. It was, in its way, almost respectful, which made it more serious than a taunt would have been. It said, "I have heard what happened. I would like to understand it." You have to sit with that for a moment. I would like to understand it. Not, I don't believe it. Not, I think I can do better. Not the chest thumping of ego that usually drives these encounters. Just, I would like to understand. That is the language of a real fighter, someone who has spent enough time in the discipline to know that the moments worth learning from are the ones you don't yet have an explanation for. Word of the message reached Bruce Lee. What happened next is one of the most debated details in the oral history of this episode. Some accounts say he agreed immediately. Some say he took 3 days. One account, from a source close to his production,
Circle at that time says he was amused by the phrasing, by "I would like to understand." Regardless of the timeline, he agreed. The second meeting was arranged for a different location, a training courtyard behind a school in the New Territories, open air, flagstone floor, surrounded by low walls. Late morning, the light came down clean and hard and left nowhere to hide. Only 4 people were present this time, 4 witnesses to what would become the second layer of the legend. The Thai fighter arrived first. He was smaller than Victor, perhaps 5'10", lean and coiled, with the particular physical economy of a man trained in Muay Thai from childhood. His hands and shins carried the permanent calcification of years of conditioning work. His face was older than his body, the face of a man who had been hit many times and had hit back harder every time. He stood in the courtyard and waited. He did not warm up, he did not stretch. He simply stood in the morning light and waited, which told the 4 witnesses everything they needed to know about his experience level. When Bruce Lee arrived, the Thai fighter looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then he said, and this exchange has been reported consistently across the accounts, "They said you moved before he moved." Bruce Lee looked at him. "I want to see if you move before I think." There is a concept in combat that the most advanced practitioners across every tradition eventually arrive at, through different language, different metaphors, different cultural frameworks, but always the same essential discovery. The concept is this: there is a layer of fighting that happens before fighting. Before the fist moves, there is intention. Before intention, there is the subtle shift of weight, the micro change in breath, the infinitesimal alteration of gaze that occurs at the moment a decision is made in the nervous system, before it has yet been executed by the body. Most fighters respond to movement. Excellent fighters respond to the intention that precedes movement. The very few, the ones that histories remember without fully explaining, respond to something even earlier, something closer to the potential of intention. Bruce Lee's former students, when asked about training with him, almost all arrive at the same description from different directions. They describe a feeling, during sparring, during drills, during the controlled exchanges of Jeet Kune Do practice, of being responded to before they had fully committed to what they were doing, of finding resistance or redirection at the precise moment of their own decision, as if the decision itself had been visible. He sees it before it happens, they said, not predicting, not guessing, seeing. The Thai fighter moved first. He was fast, genuinely, frighteningly fast. The 4 witnesses later agreed that his initial combination would have landed against almost anyone else on earth who was standing in that courtyard that morning. 2 strikes, hand, then elbow, each one moving at a velocity that the flagstone floor and the open-air morning light made more visible, not less, because there was nowhere for the speed to hide. They did not land. Not because Bruce Lee blocked them, not because he parried them, not because he moved backward out of their range. He wasn't there when they arrived. He had moved, not laterally, not backward, but through the space between the strikes, occupying the gap that the combination itself created, and he was now inside the Thai fighter's reach, at a range where the elbow and the kick and the knee, the most devastating weapons of Muay Thai, had no room to operate. One hand, his left palm, open, found the Thai fighter's chest. Not a strike, not a throw, a touch. A touch with the weight of everything behind it,
The hips, the rotation, the focused transmission of force through a relaxed and therefore maximally conductive arm. The TIE fighters sat down. Not fell, not collapsed, sat down, as though his legs had simply decided, independently, to place him on the flagstone floor. He sat there for several seconds. The 4 witnesses did not move. Bruce Lee stood over him, not threatening, not posturing, simply present. His left hand had returned to his side. His breathing was unchanged from what it had been when he walked through the courtyard gate. The TIE fighter looked up at him from the ground. And then, 4 witnesses confirmed this, he started to laugh. Not the laugh of humiliation, not the desperate social performance of someone trying to recover their dignity, a genuine laugh, the laugh of a man who has just received the answer to the question he came to ask, and the answer was better than anything he had imagined. "I understand now," he said, from the flagstone floor. He said it in Thai. One of the witnesses, who spoke the language, translated it immediately. Bruce Lee looked at him, and for the first time in either encounter, across both meetings, across all 13 witnesses and all the charged silence and the myth that was already building itself around him, he smiled. Small, brief, a single line of warmth that crossed his face and was gone. But the witness who spoke Thai said that what Bruce Lee said next, quietly, not for the room but for the man on the ground, was this: "You asked the right question." 4 witnesses, a flagstone courtyard in the New Territories, no cameras, no documentation, just a man on the ground who had asked the right question and received his answer in the only language that question could be answered in. The 2 encounters, Kowloon and the New Territories, live in the martial arts historical underground as a pair. They are discussed together, always, because separately they are astonishing. Together they are something else. Together they are a complete statement. The first encounter says, size is not the variable you think it is. The second says, speed is not the variable you think it is either. Because the TIE fighter was fast, genuinely, independently, verifiably fast, the kind of fast that didn't need Bruce Lee as a reference point to be impressive, and his speed had found nothing to land on. Both encounters arrive at the same conclusion from different directions. The variable, the actual variable, was not physical at all. Bruce Lee said it in interviews. He wrote it in his notes, the dense private notebooks that his wife Linda preserved and that researchers have spent decades working through. He said it publicly and he said it privately, and he said it in the language of philosophy and in the language of physics and in the language of poetry, because he understood that different people needed different doors into the same room. Empty your mind. Not as metaphor, not as Eastern mysticism cosplaying as combat advice, as literal instruction. The mind that is full of its strategy, its plan, its ego's investment in a specific outcome, its calculation of the other person's weight and reach and probable response, that mind is slow. Not because the body is slow. The body may be exceptionally fast, but the mind's fullness creates a lag, a fraction of a second of processing between perception and response, between seeing and doing. The empty mind has no lag. It perceives and responds as a single event. It does not interpret. It does not calculate. It does not check its answer against its expectation. It simply is the response. This is what Viktor Sorokin spent 3 months preparing to fight, and this is what he couldn't prepare for, because you cannot prepare for
something that has no fixed shape. You cannot build a defense against the water until you understand what water is. The footage was never released. There was never any footage, but the words of 9 people, and then 4 more, carried across decades like something that refuses to sink, resurfacing in interviews, in the notes of martial arts historians, in the careful accounts of witnesses who aged but did not forget. Because some things are too precise to forget. The sound Victor made. The way the TIE fighter sat down onto flagstone as if he'd chosen to. The smile, brief, warm, there and gone, that Bruce Lee allowed himself at the end. And the question the TIE fighter asked, which turned out to be the right one. Can you move before I think? Yes. Not because of the hours in the gym, not because of the genetics, not because of the speed, though the speed was real and it was extraordinary, and no one who saw it ever described it adequately. Because of the silence. The silence that Victor noticed before anything else happened. The silence the Wing Chun practitioner from Guangzhou recognized as the most dangerous possible sign. The silence that was not absence, but fullness of a different kind. The fullness of a mind that had been emptied so completely it could hold the whole world in it without being heavy.
13 witnesses across 2 meetings. No official record, no belt, no trophy, no certificate framed on a wall. Just the truth of what happens when a human being has gone far enough into their own practice that they stop performing skill and simply become it. Viktor Sorokin flew back to Moscow. The TIE fighter returned to wherever he came from, carrying something more valuable than a win. Bruce Lee went back to work. Back to the films, back to the philosophical writing, back to the training that never stopped being training, even when everyone around him thought the work was already done. Because the work was never done. That was the point. That was the whole point. A teacher is never a giver of truth, he wrote. He is a guide, a pointer to the truth that each student must find for himself. He was talking about teaching, but he was also talking about the only education that matters, the one that a 240-pound man received in 9 seconds on a worn jute mat, and a TIE fighter received on Flagstone in the clean morning light of the new territories. You cannot be taught what Bruce Lee knew. You can only be shown where to look. And then, if you are willing, if you are honest, if you are brave enough to actually empty yourself of everything you are certain you already knew, you go look.